In the spring of 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces made a decision that had nothing to do with strategy or battlefield needs. They were finally sending their first all-black fighter squadron into combat. Officially, it was called the Tuskegee Experiment. Unofficially, it was a test many people expected to fail. At the time, millions, including top generals in Washington and the Nazi leadership in Berlin, held the racist doctrine that black men lacked the intelligence, the courage, and the discipline for the complex, high-stakes ballet of aerial combat. They were, according to the official assessment, inferior. Yet, even as they trained in segregated Alabama, these men understood they had two enemies. One flew a Messerschmitt, the other wore the same uniform. Their war was double-fronted, a battle for freedom overseas and a battle for recognition at home. But over the years, this group of men, doubted by their own country and mocked by their enemy, took to the skies and proved everyone wrong. In 1925, the United States Army War College published a report that became doctrine. The words were bureaucratic and devastating. Negro soldiers were admittedly of inferior mentality and weak in character. The report concluded that black men lacked the intelligence and courage required for complex military operations. It became an official policy, stamped and filed in Washington. Across the Atlantic, another doctrine was taking shape. The Nazi ideology of Untermensch declared the entire races biologically incapable of higher thought or heroism. When these two prejudices converged over the skies of Europe, they created a shared assumption among both American skeptics and German pilots. Black men could not fly fighters in combat. The premise seemed unshakable. Flying demanded split-second decisions at 400 miles per hour and the nerve to face death without flinching. The established powers on both sides of the conflict believed these qualities belonged exclusively to white men. What they didn't anticipate was that, no matter how widespread, it collapses the moment it meets reality at 25,000 feet. In March 1941, the War Department activated the 99th Pursuit Squadron at Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama. They didn't call it a unit. They called it an experiment. The language was deliberate and cold, as if they were testing a new fuel mixture rather than the capabilities of American citizens. The question being examined made it even more insulting. Could Negro pilots handle combat aviation? Leading this experiment was Second Lieutenant Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. He had graduated from West Point in 1936 and was the first black cadet in 40 years. For 4 years, no one spoke to him, not in class or barracks. His classmates enforced what they called silencing, a coordinated act of erasure designed to break him. But Davis did not break. He graduated 35th in a class of 276, returned the silence with discipline, and became the man who would lead the 99th into combat. The pilots who followed him to Tuskegee weren't naive. They knew they were flying under a magnifying glass. Every mistake would be used as proof of inherent inferiority. Every success would be dismissed as an outlier. Training was brutal by design. The standards were not lowered, they were raised. Tuskegee instructors washed out students at higher rates than white training programs, knowing that mediocrity would doom the entire enterprise. The men who made it through were sharp, disciplined, and angry in the focused way that turns humiliation into fuel. When the 99th shipped out to North Africa in April 1943, they flew obsolete Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, planes already being phased out by frontline units. They were assigned to tactical ground support, the unglamorous work of strafing trucks and escorting reconnaissance flights. July 2, 1943, dawned hot and hazy over Sicily. The Allied invasion was in full swing, and the skies were thick with German fighters defending the island. 4 P-40 Warhawks of the 99th Pursuit Squadron were flying patrol over the beachhead at Licata when the radio crackled with urgency. German fighters inbound, low and fast. First Lieutenant Charles B. Hall was flying as part of that patrol. He was 23 years old, a farm boy from Indiana who had earned his wings at Tuskegee after graduating from Eastern Illinois State Teachers College. Nothing in his background suggested he was destined for this moment. But combat has a way of stripping away everything except what a man can do when the world is screaming past his canopy. Hall spotted the enemy first, a lone Focke-Wulf FW-190, banking hard and diving toward Allied positions. The German pilot was focused on the ground, hunting targets, and never looked up. Hall pushed the throttle forward, rolled inverted, and dropped into a steep dive. The P-40's Allison engine roared as the desert floor rushed up to meet him. At 300 yards, Hall opened fire. The .650 caliber Browning machine guns hammered, tracers arcing through the air in a bright, deadly stream. Strikes walked across the FW-190's fuselage and wing root. The German fighter shuddered and then nosed over into a violent spiral. It hit the ground near Castelvetrano and exploded in a fireball that sent black smoke billowing into the Sicilian sky. Back at base, the moment Hall landed, ground crews swarmed the plane. They had heard the radio chatter and knew what had happened. Word spread like wildfire, the first kill marking for the 99th Pursuit Squadron. A black pilot had shot down a German fighter in combat. The impossible had happened. The War College report, the silent treatment at West Point, the Nazi doctrine of Untermensch, all of it collapsed. But the skeptics were not convinced. They called it luck. They said one kill proved nothing. The real test would come when the 99th faced sustained, brutal combat against Germany's best. By January 1944, the 99th had been rotated to the Italian mainland and attached to the 79th Fighter Group. They were still flying P-40s, still assigned to the least glamorous missions, and treated as an experiment that might be quietly disbanded if they failed to perform. Then came Anzio. The Allied amphibious landing at Anzio was supposed to break the stalemate in Italy. Instead, it became a desperate siege. German forces counterattacked with overwhelming strength, and the Luftwaffe threw everything it had at the vulnerable beachhead. Wave after wave of German bombers and fighters attacked Allied positions, and the skies turned into a killing field. On January 27th and 28th, the 99th was thrust into the center of the storm. Massive German raids, some involving 30 to 40 aircraft, swept in low over the beachhead. The P-40s, obsolete and outclassed on paper, climbed to meet them. What followed was 2 days of the most vicious air combat the 99th had yet experienced. Captain Clarence Jameson led a flight of 4 P-40s into a formation of Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt Bf 109s. The German pilots, veterans of the Eastern Front and North Africa, expected an easy fight. They saw the worn P-40s and assumed they were facing inexperienced pilots flying inferior machines. They were half right about the machines. Jameson's flight tore into the German formation with brutal efficiency. The P-40 couldn't outturn or outclimb the German fighters, but the Tuskegee pilots had learned to use aggression and flawless gunnery. In the first pass, Lieutenant Robert Dees sent a Bf 109 spinning into the sea. Moments later, Lieutenant Charles Bailey shredded an FW-190's wing with a concentrated burst, and the German fighter disintegrated in midair. Over 2 days, the 99th shot down between 8 and 13 German aircraft, the exact number lost to the chaos of combat reporting. What mattered was not the precise tally, but the undeniable fact that the experiment had just carved through the Luftwaffe and saved the beachhead from being overrun. Ground troops who had watched the dogfights from the beach sent messages of thanks. Allied commanders who had dismissed the 99th as a political gesture suddenly began requesting their support. The skeptics in the War Department went quiet. By early 1944, the 99th was joined by three more squadrons, the 100th, 301st, and 302nd, forming the 332nd Fighter Group under the command of Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. They were re-equipped with newer aircraft, first P-39 Airacobras, then P-47 Thunderbolts, and finally the iconic North American P-51 Mustang. With the Mustang, they were given the mission that would define their legacy. Davis gathered his pilots and gave them an order that became the defining philosophy of the Red Tails. "Our mission is to bring the bombers home. We do not chase kills." It was a radical departure from the prevailing fighter doctrine. Most escort groups allowed their pilots to break off and pursue German fighters, racking up individual kill counts and building reputations. The 332 end refused. They flew tight, protective formations around the bomber streams, absorbing attacks and driving off German interceptors without abandoning their charges. This discipline was not natural, staying glued to slow, lumbering bombers while German fighters darted in and out of range required a level of restraint that went against every instinct. But Davis had chosen his philosophy carefully. He knew that every bomber lost would be used as evidence of black incompetence. The Red Tail identity emerged during this period. The 332nd began painting the tails of their P-51 Mustangs in distinctive red, making them instantly recognizable. Bomber crews began requesting Red Tail escorts specifically. In the brutal mathematics of the air war, that request was the highest compliment possible. It meant the men flying those bombers trusted the Tuskegee Airmen with their lives. By the war's end, the numbers told a story that even the most entrenched prejudice could not erase. The 332nd Fighter Group flew 1,578 combat missions and 15,533 sorties. They destroyed 112 enemy aircraft in the air and another 150 on the ground. But the statistic that mattered most was that the bombers escorted by the 332nd Fighter Group lost only 27 aircraft to enemy fighters over the course of the war. The average loss rate for other escort groups was 46 bombers. That difference represented hundreds of lives saved. The crowning achievement came on March 24, 1945, during a mission to Berlin. The 332nd was escorting B-17 Flying Fortresses deep into the heart of the Reich when German jet fighters appeared. The Messerschmitt Me-262 was the most advanced fighter in the world, capable of speeds exceeding 540 miles per hour, nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51 Mustang. Three Me-262s dove on the bomber formation, their 30mm cannons capable of tearing a B-17 apart with a single burst. Captain Roscoe Brown, leading the escort, spotted them and radioed a warning. At 500 miles per hour with the jet just ahead, Brown opened fire. The 50 caliber rounds stitched across the Me-262's fuselage, and the jet exploded in a ball of flame. Minutes later, Lieutenant Earl Lane and Lieutenant Charles Brantley each destroyed a Me-262 in the same engagement. Three of the most advanced aircraft in the Luftwaffe, destroyed in a single mission by pilots the U.S. Army War College had declared mentally inferior. When the gun camera footage was reviewed, there was no room for doubt. By late 1944, something had shifted in the German intelligence briefings. Luftwaffe pilots, debriefed after encounters with American fighters, began reporting a specific detail. Mustangs with red tails fought differently. German pilots began calling them Schwarze Vogelmenschen, the Black Birdmen. The name carried no mockery. The laughter that had greeted the 99th in 1943 was long gone. In its place was the uncomfortable acknowledgement that they had been wrong. On April 19, 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender, Lieutenant Alexander Jefferson's B-24 Liberator was shot down over France. He was captured and spent months in a German POW camp, enduring the same brutal conditions as white American prisoners. When the camp was liberated and Jefferson returned to the United States, he experienced a moment of profound, bitter irony. At the disembarkation point in Virginia, he was separated from white POWs and directed to a colored waiting area. His own countrymen, the people he had risked his life to defend, could not let him sit in the same room as the men he had been imprisoned with. That same month, the Freeman Field Mutiny erupted. Black officers of the 477th Bombardment Group stationed at Freeman Field in Indiana were told they could not enter the base officers' club, which had been designated for whites only. On April 5th, over 100 black officers walked into the club in a coordinated act of defiance. They were arrested and charged with insubordination. The mutiny was carefully planned, a direct challenge to the military's segregation policy. The men knew the risks, but they did it anyway because they had proven their worth in combat and refused to accept second-class citizenship in uniform. The case drew national attention. Civil rights organizations rallied behind the officers. The NAACP provided legal support, and slowly, the wall began to crack. The Tuskegee Airmen's combat record became an undeniable argument against segregation. On July 26, 1948, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981, mandating the integration of the U.S. Armed Forces. The order did not cite the Tuskegee Airmen by name, but their influence was inescapable. Decades later, when historians attempted to explain the Tuskegee Airmen's success, they often pointed to technical factors: superior training, disciplined tactics, and excellent aircraft. The Red Tails succeeded because the men were fighting for the right to be seen as fully human. Every mission was a referendum. Every bomber brought home safely was proof that the premise was a lie. They could not afford mediocrity because mediocrity would be used to justify centuries of oppression. In 2007, the Tuskegee Airmen were collectively awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor in the United States. President George W. Bush stood before the surviving airmen and acknowledged what had been done to them. The men who received that medal were in their 80s and 90s. Some arrived in wheelchairs, others walked with canes. They listened to the speeches, accepted the applause, and returned back quietly. The Tuskegee Airmen's story forces a confrontation with an uncomfortable truth. The prejudice they faced was not abstract or historical. It was enshrined in official policy, defended by military leadership, and accepted by millions as scientific fact. The idea that black men could not fly was considered common sense, and the men who challenged it were dismissed as participants in a doomed experiment. Yet those men climbed into P-40s, P-47s, and P-51s and fought with precision and discipline. They did not win by accident. They won because they were better prepared, more focused, and unwilling to accept the limitations imposed on them by a society that refused to see them clearly.